I think I'll make a start. Thanks for joining in and welcome to the irrigation webinar series. I think we're up to number 12 today. This is the third and final webinar in our sub-series, Who Got the Irrigation Water This Season and Why, how Southern Murray-Darling Basin water is shared. And the webinar today will focus mainly on water trade and how that impacts on Southern Basin water availability. My name's Rob O'Connor. I work with Ag Vic in the irrigation team based at Echuca. Just letting you know that you have been muted and this webinar is being recorded, and a copy of the recording will be sent as a link to webinar participants, hopefully next week. If you do have any technical problems, please get in touch with John Paulette using either the chat function in Zoom or using the email address or phone number on the screen there. John works at Tatura, based at Tatura, with the Ag Vic irrigation team too. If you have any questions, please submit them through the chat function on Zoom and select co-host for questions. We will be taking questions at the end of the webinar, and we might have a break for questions through the webinar, depending on how we're going for time. We do value your feedback, so if you could fill in the few questions that will come up on the screen during question time at the end of the webinar, that would be highly appreciated. And we're aiming to finish at 2 o'clock. Just a thank you to our supporters, to the CMAs along the Murray River, the Goulburn Murray Water, Lower Murray Water, Regional Development Victoria, DG Consulting, and also to Ag Vic. What we're trying to achieve in this webinar series in a practical sense is just to help participants better understand the different factors influencing Southern Basin water availability. So in future seasons, they'll be better able to anticipate upcoming irrigation water availability and be able to make earlier and more informed decisions to better manage variable water supplies. Just a reminder that the previous recordings from this irrigation webinar series can be accessed through Extension Oz, Irrigating Ag online. And just about today's webinar, our speaker today is Garry Smith. Garry is a director with DG Consulting. He has over 30 years experience in the water industry in a range of different roles, working for different organisations and different locations across the Murray-Darling Basin. So it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Garry.
Thanks, Rob. Okay, so as Rob's indicated, we're talking about water trade and water policy today, which is a huge subject. So we're going to try and cover a fair bit of ground. The main areas that we'll cover will be water trading, water trade limits and what they're all about and why. We'll have a bit of a look into the Barmer Miller environmental water allocation and how that works, and then have a quick circle around on the irrigation outlook for the coming water year. So we will cover a number of areas and we'll try and stay at a reasonably high level and give you pointers on where you can find out more information if you'd like to do so. So let's dive into water trading. So we're not going to try and give you a deep knowledge of water trade, but just to talk about a few issues around water trade and some of the things you might keep an eye out for. Just it's worthwhile just thinking about water markets and how they've grown and evolved. This slide shows the evolution of water markets since they were first established in Northern Victoria. You can see here back 1991, permanent trade, as it was then known, first started. And this chart shows entitlement prices over that time since 1991. And what I've tried to do is capture there with it some of the big issues that have changed the trajectory of entitlement prices. And you can see that certainly weather conditions, recovery of water from the environment, horticultural expansion have been significant events that have coincided with changes in value for water entitlements over time. Other area that we wanted to then sort of move on to was thinking about, well, what is, we can see some of those drivers there, but I guess allocation market is one of the important areas for water users. So what I want to think about is what influences allocation markets and how you might think about them. And clearly allocation markets, annual supply and availability of water and demand factors really influence allocation markets and volumes and prices very strongly. So on this graph, you can see the volume of allocation trade in Northern Victoria on the left axis, and you can see the medium allocation price on the right axis, and that red line shows that allocation price. Now, as we move across from 2007 to about 2018-19, you see the left-hand bar, the blue bars show the water available through carryover, allocation and trade in, and the green shows water use. So what we can see sitting below it is what the climate was doing at the time. So we were going through drought here, low water availability, and high prices for allocation. The other thing we're showing here below that and below those climate things is the New South Wales Murray General Security allocations, which are an important factor in overall water availability given the large volume on issue. So you can see here low availability there is also part of that. In drought, there was low availability as well. So very tight volumes, so supply was constrained, strong demand, so high price. And we can see as we recovered, higher allocations, wet and average conditions, lots more water available, prices responded accordingly. But then as we moved back into a drying phase and we saw some reduction in water availability and lower allocations, again, the prices responded and spiked up there until we got to 15-16 when it turned wetter. And so we've got these, again, the prices responded by dropping down. And then 17-18, 18-19, we had those drier conditions and some of the very low allocations. There is zero allocation against New South Wales General Security, combined with dry conditions. So that low water availability and high demand from dry conditions pushed water prices right back up there. So those are some of the things to watch out for in the allocation market. And there's lots of information out there if you want to track that. The Bureau of Meteorology collects information as well as the state water registers. The Bureau of Meteorology collects information and they have quite a nice water markets dashboard. There's a couple of examples here that you can look back over an extended period and see what's happening with price and volumes traded in different systems. So you can see the Goulburn here and the Victorian Murray here from 2008-9 up until 2021-22. Again, showing median price, and you'll see very similar behaviours. Well, you'll note that the Murray's going up a little higher on the peaks, are going up above 600 there, not quite getting up to those levels in the Goulburn. But you can see the same sort of broad behaviours happening in both systems, reflecting connected systems and some of the price linkages between them. The other area you can get information on volumes and prices of water allocation. As you're probably all aware, the Victorian Water Register has lots of information. And we thought it'd be worthwhile to just have a little look at what's happened this year and last year with price. Most people will be closely aware of that, but let's just go through that again. What we saw, this is the Goulburn, Greater Goulburn, Zone 1A, and you'll see there that the upper line, this lighter coloured line, is last year's price. The lower line is the 21-22 price. So you can see that the weather conditions and higher allocations in the current year have depressed price compared to the previous year quite significantly. The median price for the year across the Goulburn was $60. It started off with a median price of around $95 here in July 2021 and ended up the year on a median price of $18 at the end of the year. The other thing to think about is with allocation is where's water moving from and to. And Victoria Water Registers can also give you some information around that. Is a simple graph of net trade into the Zone 1A, the Greater Goulburn, and you can see that there's been not unexpectedly this year there's been net trade out of the Goulburn, but in previous years we can see a little spike there. There's been net trade out, net trade into the Goulburn, then a bit of net trade out, but followed by a bit of a kick up with some trade back in, which we could assume is tied to people moving water upstream through back trade to park water in anticipation of preparation for the coming year. Obviously, this year there'll be some different strategies being employed given the high volumes of water available and the large carryover volumes around. The thing about Victoria and Murray allocation prices, this is a similar graph to the one we saw earlier. What you'll notice here is that obviously again the price in 21-22 was lower than it was in the previous year, so that's fairly similar. Median price started off at $78 there. Median price across the whole year was $78. That was compared to $60 for the Goulburn. It started off in July 2021 at $144 there compared to the Goulburn's $95, and it ended up at $19 in this current month just ending compared to the Goulburn's 18. So it finished about the same place but started from quite different starting points, reflecting strong demand in that Zone 7 area. When we look at water trading in and out as well, same view here. You can see that in that Zone 7, some net trade in early in the season, and then significant net trade out, which we can assume is linked to environmental trades there. Another look at that and another dimension is of the Bureau of Meteorology's market dashboard. If you go into that, there's the opportunity to look at where's water's trading from and to. It gives you a little more of a breakdown than just the net amounts. And this is for the same zone for the Victorian Murray which is Zone 6 and 7. It gives that price what water there in the yellow bar is traded within the zone in that system. These lighter blue bars are trade in from outside, so trade from South Australia there, trade from the New South Wales Murray, and trade from the Goulburn, and then trade out. So trade out to New South Wales Murray from Victorian Murray, trade out to South Australia Murray, which, given the very large volume of it, there predominantly is likely to be environmental trade, and some smaller trades out back to the Goulburn, again possibly aligned with some parking opportunities. So lots of information out there across the water registers and the Bureau of Meteorology Water Markets dashboard on what's happening with allocation trade, price, and where the water's moving to and from. But if we're thinking about water moving between systems, that takes us to the question about what are water trade limits about and how do they work? So we'll just do a very quick roundup or a bit of a backgrounder on water trading zones and what it's all about. So apologies for people who are really familiar with that. But you can see on the left there a map, which is the schematic map of the different trading zones across the Southern Connected Basin. You can see them all in different colours there. So a trading zone is a system which is supplied from a common source. So within a trading zone, it's coming from the same reservoirs, same sources of water. There are little or no limits on trade within the zone, and that's part of how they're designed. But trading between zones needs to be managed to make sure there's no unacceptable impact. So one of the key issues is if you're moving water from one trading zone to another, if you're trading entitlements from one zone to another, for example, from the Goulburn to the Murray, water needs to be moved between those systems to back the traded allocations or traded entitlements so that there's no impact on water reliability in either system. So that brings us to the question of we need to track and account for all of that stuff. So water accounting happens at 3 different levels in the Southern Murray-Darling Basin. At the top level, you have wholesale or bulk accounts, which the MDBA operates, which gives the states their share of water. It looks at all the water flowing in and who's got rights to it under the Murray-Darling Basin Agreement. Then once the states have their share of water, they do their own water accounting at a bulk level as well. And that looks at their seasonal determinations, making the seasonal allocation announcements, managing diversions and accounting for the diversions to irrigation areas, from return flows from tributaries and so on, and also the intervalley transfers account that we'll talk to in a moment. Down at the retail account level, this is the allocations to individual allocation accounts, and where we track usage and trade between individual entitlement holders. So if we think about these 3 levels, allocation trade is happening here at the retail level, but the intersystem transfers to make sure the water to back that is happening here at the wholesale level, at the state shares, and at this wholesale level through movement of water between shares in Dartmouth or Hume as necessary. So to do all this work and to keep track of this at the wholesale level, intersystem transfers that adjust the water available and make sure that the water is transferred to back the traded allocations or entitlements. We use intervalley transfer accounts to cover this. So how this works is when we're trading between zones, we've already talked about, obviously, there's some issues you need to manage. First one is the direct resource risk. You've got to actually transfer the water and make it available to the destination system so that so it backs the traded entitlements. So there's the direct resource risk is managed through IVT accounts. There's also an issue that sometimes there are limits on IVT accounts to manage the risk of spill. If you've got water in the system of origin in a reservoir and it spills, it's no longer available, but the traded allocation or entitlement is in the destination system and it's still got a right. There's no water available to transfer and back that, so that risk of spills can create impacts on other water users. There's also limited connection risks. For example, with IVTs, if you're trading from the Goulburn into the Murray, you can't trade water from the Murray up to the Goulburn and make it run uphill. You can certainly make it run downhill by gravity and deliver it. So there are limits there that you can't trade there unless there's a positive balance in the intervalley transfer account that you can substitute against through what's known as a back trade. So if there's no prior trade out and a positive balance in the intervalley transfer account, you can't back trade against that. And also a more recent development as trade's grown and evolved, we've recognised that there are sometimes trade can require unsustainable flows in rivers, particularly at the wrong time of year. And so that's been a factor that's emerged more recently, and we'll talk a little about the Goulburn to Murray trade rule arrangements, which are in large part driven by some of those concerns as well. What you see here in this diagram here is a schematic of all of the trading zones in the connected Southern Basin. This is available on the Victorian Water Register. And at every point of interconnection of the trading zone, you can see that there are small markers there that show there's an IVT account there that maps and tracks the balance of the movement of water between systems. So for the Goulburn, there'll be no IVTs. What's the water owed from the Goulburn to the Murray to back trade, and that's trade that's occurred, and also tracking against that what water's traded back up into the Goulburn from the Murray, which reduces the balance in the intervalley transfer account there. So very much a strong accounting basis, and you'll note there are a lot of those points. This particular opportunity on the water register, if you go, it's alive and interactive, and it'll tell you what the opportunities are at all of those interchange points if you want to explore where can I trade from or to with my water. So thinking about those different sorts of issues that limits on intervalley transfer accounts are trying to manage, the direct resource risk, the spill risk, limited connection risks, or sustainable river flows risks. Here are some of the key intersystem trade points. and the limits that apply. There's the Goulburn to Murray, and it's around the direct resource risk, the spill risk, limited connection risk, and the sustainable flows, river flows risk. And we'll talk a little more about that in a moment. Murrumbidgee, the limit on that is the IVT can be between 0 and 100 GL. And so that's to manage direct resource risk. So in dry conditions, there are high losses in the lower Bidgee to deliver water from the Murrumbidgee into the Murray. So in dry conditions, there'll be impacts on resources available to the Murray to back traded water. But also in wet conditions, there's risk of spill at the storages in the upper Murrumbidgee at Blowering and Burrinjup. So that water might be lost and not available either. So the limit there of 100 GL is seeking to get a balance between those dry condition risks and those wet condition risks to make available a reasonable trade opportunity. On the Barmer choke, the limit for the Barmer choke rule is that there's no net trade allowable from upstream of the choke to downstream of the choke. And that's really about direct resource risk, but it's also about sustainable flows. The Barmer choke operates at or near capacity for extended periods in higher demand years. So in trying to increase the flow through there would provide unsustainable conditions impacting further on the riverbank, but also risking undesirable flooding of the red gum forests there at times of year when it would do damage rather than good. So the Barmer choke rule's been in place for some time, and in order to trade downstream through the choke, there needs to have been a previous trade upstream so that there's no overall increase in pressure on the choke. For the New South Wales trade for allocation from the New South Wales Murray to the Victorian Murray system, that limit is 200 gigalitres or 50, or the volume that's will enable the risk of spill in Hume or Dartmouth to be maintained below 50%. So that one's about spill risk. If water's transferred from Murray to Vic Murray to Vic Murray from New South Wales Murray, that's done by an internal transfer in counting between the half shares in Lake Hume that are held by New South Wales and Victoria. Now, if Victoria's share happens to be nearly full and additional water is transferred into it in response to an allocation transfer, there may be an internal spill, in which case the water is lost and is not available to meet that increased obligation arising from the allocation trade. So it's really about saying when there's plenty of airspace, this is not a problem, and so there's quite a large opportunity. But if there's a higher than 50% risk of spill, we need to perhaps limit the volume of allocation trade so that the reliability of the overall system isn't affected adversely. Barmer choke's an interesting one too, and we have had, I think we've had some questions about Barmer choke. So just by way of notice, the MDBA have made announcements that there will be a reasonably high opening balance this year compared to other years as a result of their assessment of the snowy water savings that can create an opportunity for trade through the choke. So that trade opportunity, the MDBA will make that available from 12:05 AM on 1st of July 2022. So very early on the first day of the water year. In Victoria, if you want to trade, you can do online allocation trades from 12:05 AM onwards. In New South Wales, you can launch your applications from midday on the day before, on the 30th of June, and New South Wales will start processing those applications at 7 AM on the 1st of July 2022. And if you want to find out what the available balance is on any given day, that's on the MDBA website. You can have a look at that and find out what's going on if you're interested in trading from above the choke to below the choke. Let's turn to the Goulburn to Murray trade rule and some of the changes that have just been announced there. There's been there's an interim rule for 21-22, and now a final rule has been announced. So the new operating rules are, there's been new operating rules for flows in the lower Goulburn River, and that's aimed at ensuring sustainable regulated flows in that reach, while still balancing that against the desire to provide reasonable and opportunities for trade. So the aim of those operating rules for regulated flows is to match the delivery of intervalley transfer water to the use of those traded water that might be occurring in the Murray system. So the trade rule also aims to match the volume of trade that can occur with the volume that can be delivered under those new operating rules, so that we don't keep building up a trade balance that can't be sustainably delivered down the system. So what's expected to happen, and these figures will be, they're approximate because it will depend on the particular seasonal circumstances, but in general terms, on 1st of July, it's likely that around 85 gigalitres of trade opportunity will be announced. On the 15th of October, there'll be a further announcement, and that might be up to about 30 gigalitres of extra trade opportunity in an average year. There'll be another announcement on the 15th of December of any additional trade opportunity, and that could be also in a typical year, it might be around 30 gigalitres of additional trade opportunity. So after the 15th of December, there'll be no further announcements of extra trade opportunities, and additional trade can only occur if back trade into the Goulburn occurs to create an opportunity without increasing the overall flows in the system. So the focus is on that the trade commitments up to that point can then be delivered from mid-December on through the end of the season. So there's a high likelihood that water that's been traded and is owed to the Murray can actually be delivered within the year when it's being used. So what happens there is with the October announcements, the amount of additional trade opportunity will depend on how people have been using water in the Murray in the winter and early spring. And if that usage shows that the summer peak mightn't be as concentrated as it would normally be, if there's been more water used earlier in the year, that can then more trade might be able to be allowed within the summer operational limits. And similarly, in December, the same sort of process will occur. And there will be a look at the winter and spring use in the Murray system to see how that's going and if there's opportunities for additional transfers to occur from the Goulburn to the Murray. So also, if there's spills from Lake Eildon, that can reduce how much water still needed to be set aside for some of the legacy commitments that go into the intervalley transfers account. So if that happens, that might create some further opportunities for trade between the Goulburn and the Murray that can be delivered within the operating limits. So the things to watch out for that might influence the October and December additional trade opportunity announcements are winter and spring water use in the Turrumbra irrigation area, which is the primary area where that sort of winter-spring demand occurs. And if they're using more than normal, the trade opportunity will increase. If they're using less than normal, there might be less than that sort of 30 gigalitres indicative figure might be announced. Also, allocation levels for Goulburn high reliability water shares. If the Goulburn, one of the commitments that goes into the intervalley transfer account from the Goulburn to the Murray is water that backs historic trades that were done by exchange rate when Goulburn entitlements were traded to the Murray and converted into Murray high reliability entitlements. That's not the practice anymore, but up until 2007, that was the case. So there's about 140 gigalitres of legacy commitments involving those historic trades. So as the Goulburn allocation increases, that water needs to be transferred into the Murray and is put into the intervalley transfer account and then drawn out to meet demands in the Murray. If the allocation levels in the Goulburn are not expected to reach 100%, the commitment or the need to transfer that water is reduced, so that may free up some additional trading opportunities. So that'll be assessed and might be announced in the December announcements, for example. So watching that, allocation levels are on the Northern Victorian Resource Manager website, as are Eildon spill activities, and monitoring water use around the system is also available through there and through the water register. So just a quick look at some of the drivers behind that and how much use has been made of a couple of the key IVTs, which are the Goulburn and Murrumbidgee IVTs. You can see there the light blue is the deliveries from the Goulburn to the Murray from the IVT account since 2004-05 right up until 2019-20. And the darker blue purpley sort of colour on top is what's been called out from the traded and called out from the Murrumbidgee IVT account. So you can see that there was quite a deal of balance between those through until about 2013-14, started to grow, but still quite modest numbers. But what we saw then was changes in activity, less water coming out of the Bidgie, more out of the Goulburn, until we got to here in 2017-18, 2018-19, when there was no water coming out of the Murrumbidgee, and there was very high demands, increasing demands as there was increased plantings of horticulture in the lower Murray. And we saw these very high volumes of water coming out the IVT, which led to some of the damage, which highlighted some of the issues around needing to think about sustainable flow limits over the summer in the lower Goulburn River, and hence the change in the trade rules. We can see that there's as the crops that are happening in the Murrumbidgee might ebb and flow, sometimes that changes the availability of water and in coupling with the general security allocation levels in the Murrumbidgee. So we can see that in 1920, for example, there was a little more water available out of the Murrumbidgee for trade into the Murray, and so there was a bit of a rebalancing. So what we can see about that is that obviously historically it's been much lower volumes, recently very high volumes, particularly out of the Goulburn, and that's led to the need to review and revise the trade limits to make sure that trade is enabled as far as possible, but within the sustainable limits of the system. Okay, let's talk now a little bit about the Barmah environmental water allocation and how that interacts with water allocations and water availability issues. So the Barmah EWA is pretty unique. It was one of the first environmental water entitlements in the Murray. It was created in around 1997. And the entitlement is 150 gigalitres of high security allocation, and with also the opportunity for 50 gigalitres of lower security allocation. And that's provided in equal amounts, 50-50 by Victoria and New South Wales. And it sits in, when it's available, it sits in Lake Hume. But it was set up, it was negotiated with irrigators at the time, and it was set up with special conditions so as to minimise the impact on irrigation allocations in dry times. So firstly, let's think about how it's used. So it's released for forest watering, obviously, from the Barmah forest, which is the largest red gum forest in the world and a Ramsar listed website of international significance, a wetland of international significance. So releases for forest watering are triggered based on observed flows downstream of Yarrawonga Weir. So the provisions on this entitlement provide for an October release if there hasn't been a release in the last 4 years, or no 4-month flood in the current year, or if the September flows have been greater than 500 gigalitres per month and there's more than 400 gigalitres in the account. There's a potential for an October release which will follow on that September flow. Similarly, thinking about November releases, there's provisions that if the October flow is more than 500 gigalitres per month and there's more than 400 gigalitres in the account and there hasn't been a 4-month flood this year, a November release is possible, and the target flow for all of those releases is a total of 500 gigalitres per month downstream of Yarrawonga. And in the event that you've had October and November flows greater than 500 gigalitres per month, a December release might be possible, provided there's been no 4-month flood already in that year. So pretty complicated release rules, but they've been tailored to make best use of the water to supplement natural flows in the system or spills that are occurring, and also to make sure that it addresses the question of going for extended periods with no release. But in terms of some of the rules that provide flexibility and protect irrigation allocations, first of all, the high security allocation, the 100 gigalitres, which is provided 50-50 from each state, is pegged to the Victorian High Reliability Watersheds allocation. So for each 1% increase in Murray High Reliability Watersheds allocation, each state provides half a gigalitre of water, which is accounted for in Lake Hume. For the low security allocation, it's based on trigger levels that represent high inflows to the system above Lake Hume. And so when that's happening, then water is put away for that additional 50 gigalitres in entitlement. So the maximum total account is 700 gigalitres, which is 350 gigalitres for each state's share. But in low allocation years, and that water carries over from year to year subject to some spill rules, but in low allocation years, that water can be borrowed from the Goulburn and Murrumbidgee accounts and used as part of the allocation to achieve each state's target allocation. So in Victoria, the Northern Victorian Resource Manager can borrow water from the Goulburn and Murrumbidgee account up until the Murray High Reliability Watershed allocation reaches 100%. In New South Wales, the borrow can occur if the New South Wales General Security allocation is less than 30%. So payback occurs when the borrowed water is no longer required to supply the target allocation. Victorian payback this year started at 50% and continued through progressively until 100% was reached, given the good conditions. So the Northern Victorian Resource Manager in Victoria determines borrow and payback needs and timings. And that's frequently those details will be included in the announcements made around the monthly announcements made on seasonal determinations. In New South Wales, the payback occurs when the general security allocation reaches 30%. Payback will occur, and once that's paid back, the general security allocation can continue to increase. Okay, as we spoke in a previous webinar, when Lake Hume physically spills, the water in the Goulburn and Murrumbidgee accounts will also spill progressively. And the other interesting feature of this environmental water allocation is that it's about providing water into Barmah Forest, but a lot of that water returns through waterways and flows out of the forest and back into the river downstream of Barmah. And so those return flows downstream of the forest can be re-regulated and delivered for consumptive use downstream of that point. So quite some unique arrangements with that entitlement. What we see here is just a small graph of what happened in 2021 with allocations in the Murray system. Both the yellow line here is the New South Wales General Security, blue line is Victorian Murray High Reliability, and the red line is the Victorian Low Reliability. But what we'll see here is that plateau there, when it reached 30% for general security, that was when payback of the borrowed water was occurring before the New South Wales General Security took off again until it reached its maximum amount of 110%. For Victoria, as we said, in the current season, the Northern Victorian Resource Manager determined that would be paid back progressively from 50% allocation here up through to 100% allocation. So there was a progressive approach. So water being paid back and some of the inflows being obviously put in towards improving allocations at the same time. So a lot of flexibility around that to tailor it to the needs of each jurisdiction within those common rules and common principles. So there's a shared commitment to provide water for that important environmental feature. Okay, what we might turn to now is a bit of a quick look at, we've talked about trade and what's happened this year, but let's think about the outlook for next season and what that might mean to a range of issues that we've talked about over the last couple of webinars. So the outlook for the 22-23 season is overall pretty positive, as most people would be aware. And one of the starting points is to think about what's the water that's been available through the year, and you can monitor this progressively. But what we can see here, this is from the available water dashboard on the Victorian Water Register website, and similar information is also available on the Northern Victorian Resource Manager's website. But importantly, what you can see right now is that the available water split up between the environment and particularly private use. We can see that there's very large volumes of water in the Victorian Murray system there available, over 460 gigalitres, remembering that there's about roughly 1,000 gigalitres of high reliability water share on issue in that system. So a very large quantity of carryover there, water's available for carryover. And you can see what happened in the current season, that there was a lot of water went into spillable water accounts. It was initially water that was initially carried over, and then as allocations increased, was moved into spillable water accounts. And given the very high inflows and the very large pre-releases and spills that have been occurring from Lake Hume, all of that water that was transferred to spillable water accounts was subsequently spilled, but wasn't lost because it came back as allocation against high reliability and low reliability water shares. So some great information to help you think about what's going to be available in the current season, but also as we get close to the end of the season, what water's around and what might carryover look like for the coming season, which will influence availability of water and price in the market. New South Wales also publishes similar useful information. You can see here for the New South Wales Murray, red indicates the water that's been used in the current season. Blue is the water that's available in water accounts that could be ordered this season. Obviously not now, given how close we are to the end of the season. And some of the details there. So again, you can see there that there's a very large volume of water available to order. It's over 1,000 gigalitres in the New South Wales Murray as well. So they're heading into a period with some very healthy water availability and high levels of carryover can be expected there. So that's what's happening with the wash up of the current season and what water's around and might be carried over. Let's think about the outlook for what might be the water availability from allocations and other sources in the coming year as well. So Bureau of Meteorology produces rainfall outlooks. Here's for winter spring. So this is the chances of exceeding medium rainfall for August to October, which is one of the prime areas where we're looking at inflows to the Southern Murray-Darling Basin system. And you can see here, it's all of this largely covered in this blue colour, which is indicating the blue and green high prospects, high probabilities of above median rainfall occurring. So some pretty positive outlooks for rainfall, and the things that are influencing that are it's expected, it looks highly likely that a negative Indian Ocean dipole will develop and is developing, which generally is associated with higher rainfall over southeastern Australia. Also, we're seeing neutral El Nino southerly oscillation conditions. And there's warmer than average waters around northern Australia, which are fueling moisture supply, which will drive rainfall. So some good prospects for winter spring in terms of rainfall. There's, again, it's the weather. So these are only probabilities, and there's still a chance that it can be drier than median as well. Resource managers have taken all that into account, and many of you have seen this, but this is the outlook for the Murray, Victorian Murray high reliability water shares for the upcoming water year. So looking at under wet, average or dry conditions or extremely dry conditions, what might be the allocation levels. And you can see that there's a very strong prospect of good opening allocations under all scenarios, and high likelihood that even under dry scenarios or better, dry or better, we'll get to 100% of high reliability water share allocations relatively early in the season. So a pretty promising outlook there on the Murray. Similarly on the Goulburn, we're a little bit lower in storage. Eildon is not quite at the same levels as we're seeing in the Murray storages. but still some good prospects of reasonable opening allocations under average and wet conditions, and even under dry conditions there'll be allocations in the high 40s there, and good prospects of improvement, as you can see, slightly a little bit slower perhaps than the Murray, depending on the seasonal conditions, but moving into reasonable prospects under all scenarios that will reach 100% of high reliability watersheds, apart from the extreme dry conditions. We spoke earlier on trade about the importance of overall water availability, and New South Wales general security accounts for a very large volume when it's available. So this is the New South Wales Murray outlook, and you can see there slightly differently expressed, but you can see there that under extremely dry conditions at the top, still expecting a 30% allocation by 1 September, moving up to higher allocations under wetter conditions, and noting that in these later conditions in September, as the asterisk indicates, that there might be storage spills, and so even though the inflows are occurring, they might be able to be captured, given that there's probably been little usage of water by that time. So if no one's used water and there's no room in the storage, the allocation won't be able to be increased. However, if these conditions persist, you can see there that as water is used and drawn down and additional inflows occur, allocations can increase. So good prospects for general security in New South Wales, and building on that earlier information about the volume of water that's unused at the moment. The New South Wales Resource Managers has assumed the general security carryover will represent about 50% of the entitlement volume on issue. So a very large volume of carryover in New South Wales as well. For South Australia, they've also made some announcements about the outlook for next year, and there's not too much in the probability space that South Australian irrigators need to worry about, because the announcement's already been made that the opening allocation for South Australian River Murray irrigators is 100%. But since that's higher than their 50% trigger level, carryover won't be available. So any water that South Australian irrigators have unused at the moment won't be able to be carried over. So they've been aware of that since April. So no doubt they will have been active thinking about what to do with that and what other options they had available to them. So when we're thinking about outlook for next year and thinking about trade and managing water, some of the issues to keep in mind, I'm just trying to summarise a couple of things there. Obviously, the water availability outlook's very positive. We've got good carryover positions, and the allocation outlook is quite encouraging as well. There's a reasonably high prospect of wetter than median climate. So thinking back to what we said earlier, obviously allocation prices will reflect the good supply situation, and also in combination that if we do have above median rainfall, that will obviously depress the demand for applied irrigation, with more of crop water needs being met from rainfall. So allocation prices are likely to reflect that good supply position. As we've seen late in this current year, that they've moved down to lower levels. As the Victorian allocations improve, water will move into spillable accounts as well. So one of the things to think about with high storage levels and good water availability is when might the timing for a low risk of spill announcement be, and that might take a little while. So water in those spillable accounts mightn't be available for some period until storage levels decline. The other thing to remember always, it's all about the weather, so it can change. It can, as we said, there's always a prospect that it can be dry. It's not guaranteed to be wetter than median. So places to look are places like the Northern Victorian Resource Manager website or the New South Wales DPE website, where there's plenty of information on updates and outlooks available, and also information on the current allocations as they're announced. So what we've done over this series, this little sub-series of 3 webinars, is we've tried to look at water sharing in the Southern Murray-Darling Basin at a large scale. It's a very large connected water system shared between 3 states, and so we've had a look at how that water is shared. Then we've looked at how, once states have their share of the water, how do they share that between individual entitlement holders through seasonal water allocations. looking at the entitlements that are on issue across the Southern Basin and how those allocations are made and what are the policy parameters that guide that, and how other water products like carryover and supplementary water access work. And we've also had a look in the last webinar is what happens to some of those accounts when storages spill, as we've seen this year. And in this current webinar, we've looked at water trade policy issues and some of those trade limit issues and the outlook for the coming year. So I guess if we try and wrap that up across the 3 webinars, there are a range of different entitlements with different reliabilities out there across the basin. And as we said, it's a large connected system. So there's plenty of options to help meet the individual needs of your business. But in combination with those entitlements, which attract different levels of allocation, there's also water trade and carryover products that can offer flexible options to meet your water needs and also to manage risks for each farm business. And the other thing to remember that there's a lot of information available from water authorities on their websites. Water New South Wales tells you when the Murrumbidgee IVT is open and closed and what the balances are. DPE Water in New South Wales gives you information on available water determinations, what sort of seasonal allocations are around and outlooks. And the Northern Victorian Resource Manager provides similar information, and the Victorian Water Register website has a lot of useful information on trade and water availability. And in addition, don't forget the Bureau of Meteorology water trading information site. They have a very good water trading dashboard. So tapping into all of those sorts of information sources can help you make better decisions on managing your water. So that's where we might leave it. And this time, I think, Rob, for a few questions. Do we have any questions?
Thanks, Garry. Yeah, great overview there. There are a number of questions, and the first one I think you've touched on it, and that was about why do Vic water trades happen through the choke historically, well after New South Wales denying Victorian allocation owners access through the choke.
Yeah, so that has been the case in the past, and in other systems, much of the allocation trade won't start to open until the allocation announcement is made on the 1st of July. So they'll open later in the day once people are aware of what their opening allocations might be, so they know what they have to trade. But there is the opportunity, and people will have carryover available in their accounts as well as the strong prospect of a good opening allocation. So yeah, the Victoria's opening early, opening as soon as possible, so people have maximising the opportunity.
There's just a request here too, Garry, about sort of net trade, and you had a good slide on that one about net trade into and out of the different districts. From memory, it was, I think it was positive trade into Vic Murray and Goulburn, is that right? And maybe net trade out of South Australia, is that correct?
Let's go back there. Let's go back a little bit earlier, Rob. Yeah. So net trade out of there was net trade out of Vic Murray into South Australia, but largely associated with environmental water there. And on the Goulburn, we saw some net trade in 2021. We saw net trade into the Goulburn later in the season, which is assumed to be associated with end of season parking arrangements. People moving water up there, and there was a little bit of net trade out of the Goulburn there in the current year over the course of the whole year.
Okay, and just, I think based on your information, there was about 145 gigalitres that could be traded out of the Goulburn under the new rules. It might have been 85 plus 30 plus 30.
In round terms, about 150 gigalitres is likely to be the additional trade opportunity, noting that there's about 140 gigalitres of that legacy commitment that has to be also delivered down the IVT. So 150 of new trade opportunities each year is about the ballpark. plus the legacy trade volumes that need to be delivered as well.
So that, I mean, and I think from one of your graphs, the like historical trade IVT out of the Goulburn varied quite a lot. More recently, it was quite high.
Yeah, so this is deliveries out of there. So you can see that that total will be around the 300. If we take 140 of legacy and 150, it'll be up around here. But you can see the volumes of IVT delivery have been much lower than that historically. But they really grew very significantly in 17, 18, 18, 19.
So under the new rules, Garry, do you see under similar conditions for a given season? Do you see that volume will be lower under the new rules that can be traded out?
Look, it certainly won't be as high as these ones. That would be unlikely. And the other thing is that what we see sometimes in the past, we've seen if low deliveries from the IVT ended up with quite a high balance that was then needed to be delivered in the subsequent year. So if water wasn't called out, for example, in a wet year, it might have then rolled over and been called out in a subsequent dry year. So the aim of the new rule is twofold. It's about making sure that we stay within the sustainable limits of the lower Goulburn or what water can be delivered over summer without creating unacceptable levels of impact. And also making sure that the trade rule is tailored around that so that we don't allow more to trade out that has to be delivered, that can be physically delivered. So it's kept in sync. And also thinking about doing that, not allowing additional trade from mid-December onwards, so that the actual the volume that's built up in the IVT can actually be delivered across the balance of that summer and autumn period to meet demand for the water that's already been traded out, the allocation that's already been traded out in that year, so that we're not building up and carrying over water in the IVT with risks of spills or the requirement to actually have very high deliveries in a subsequent year.
Great. The payback of the Barmer Miller account, that's fairly clear in terms of, like on the Vic Murray, we start paying that back at 100% high reliability when we reach 100%. And New South Wales Murray 30% general security is when that's starting to be paid back. And that's handy to know because, we might expect a bit of a delay, like you said, in terms of the that water allocation increasing. In terms of borrowing that water, Garry, can we borrow? I think, like Vic Murray, I think you said was 350 gigs and maybe 350 gigs for New South Wales Murray. Do we borrow that every year?
If we're below 100% in Victoria, yeah, it can be borrowed. There are some water reserved, and there's some other provisions. They're quite complex rules, so there's a lot of other features. But in general terms, yeah, the water's available to be borrowed if the Victorian allocation is below 100%, and also New South Wales can borrow when they're below 30% general security.
Yep. Okay. Great. And just the Murrumbidgee, intervalley trade out of the Murrumbidgee. I don't think there was any trade out in 17, 18 and 18, 19.
Mm-hmm.
But other years there seemed to be quite a lot of trade, and I think it seems to be a bit of an issue people have trouble getting their heads around. Do you know sort of why that variability is happening, why there wasn't any trade in 17, 8, 19?
A range of reasons. Obviously, water availability in the Murrumbidgee, don't have the allocation levels, but we had over some of those periods, it was dry. That was a dry period in New South Wales. But also we saw the emergence then of some new crops. There's been a move into cotton in the Bidgee system, so some higher value crops, and so the value of water within the Bidgee rose, and so the differential, the attractiveness of using water there and the prices being paid for trade in the Bidgee rose somewhat as well. So there's a couple of factors interacting there, Rob, but lower allocations, higher demand, and also some higher value crops that people were moving into drove prices, and so the incentive to trade out was, or the need to trade out was reduced accordingly.
Yep. Okay. Thanks, Garry. I'll just remind people if they could fill in that those questions that have come up on your screen now, that would be great. This will be the last question, Garry, and you did touch on it just then, but a question around sort of, you know, the drivers of trade into and out of irrigation regions, and how they play out in sort of wet and dry seasons.
Yeah, no, that's a big question, Rob. Look, there is lots of things. Obviously, water availability is critical, and so higher water availability, people are looking at different, but demand is crucial too. So it depends on what's the allocations in the buying areas, particularly the high demand areas, and we're seeing trends are trading into the Sun Ranger region in response to horticultural development there. So that's a large demand centre. And much more of that water is coming from allocation trade these days than from permanently held entitlements, is my understanding, Rob. So, you know, they'll be driving it. So water allocations and availability in the Murray system is critical, how much can be there. And then the people looking for, if that's not meeting all the needs, they'll look at the tributaries like the Goulburn and the Murrumbidgee and what's going to go there. So depending on what's happening in those systems with availability of water and also what's the prevailing price and demand for water in those systems will determine how much intersystem trade might occur.
Fantastic. Thanks, Garry. We've put you under the pump with with those questions. Thanks for a great presentation. It's 1 minute past 2 on my clock, so I'm pretty keen to wind it up. But thank you very much, Garry, for a great presentation today and a great series of presentations over the last few webinars, and it's been great working with you on that. Thanks to John Paulette for keeping the Zoom show afloat and running, and for all your hard work, John, in this webinar series. And special thanks to all the webinar participants for joining in, for your contributions during the webinar, and I hope you got some value out of the webinar today and out of this webinar sub-series. Just a reminder, if you could fill in the evaluation questions on the screen, that would be a great help. But thanks again, and have a good afternoon. See you.